Hello everyone, my name is Jared Altic and I'm a chaplain with the police department. In this special bonus episode, you'll hear an interview I did this year with a podcaster from the UK. This is not a paid advertisement of any kind, rather it's an episode worth hearing from a podcast that I believe is worth your time. The next voice you'll hear will be Claire Sands from the Silent Y podcast, which is a fantastic show about different kinds of grief and loss. Everyone will suffer a loss of some sort sooner or later, and the Silent Y podcast is easily the best show that I know to help you work through that and come out the other side stronger. Here's Claire Sands.
Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Let's Chat. I'm Claire Sands, co-host of the Silent Y podcast and blog writer for thesilentY.com. In these episodes, I chat to a guest who has experience or expertise in a particular area that can either help us deal with, prepare for, or is linked to loss. And through them, I'm building a whole toolshed of equipment to help us face and get through loss and grief. So at the end of each episode, I ask our guest what sort of tool their subject would be, and then I'm adding it to my metaphorical shed. So far, I've had a very useful spade, a bag of compost, and a Swiss Army knife. In this episode of Let's Chat, I'm chatting to Jared Altic, who is a full-time pastor and a police chaplain in Kansas City, right in the middle of the US. And we're talking about police chaplains, who respond to families of crime victims and work long-term with police in areas of wellness. Jared hosts a podcast called Hey Chaplain, which I've recently started listening to, a fascinating insight into his work alongside police officers. And I just couldn't wait to chat to him and ask all the questions I had about what it's like to support people in a job that deals with so much loss and hurt on a daily basis. So grab a cup of tea, a coffee, a craft beer, if that's your thing, and it's after midday maybe where you are, and relax with me and Jared as we chat police chaplains.
My name is Jared Altic and I'm a chaplain with the police department. Typically, my day job is I work at a church. And so I'm a pastor at a church. I write sermons. I teach adult classes. I do counseling, that kind of thing, weddings and funerals and all that sort of thing. But I also volunteer with the local police department in Kansas City. And I am on call. So I have a police car. And I used to carry around a pager. Now they've switched over to contacting us through our phones. But whenever there's an unattended death, they will call me. So that'd be homicides, suicides, accidental deaths, natural deaths where there was no doctor present. And when it's deemed necessary, I'll be called out. A lot of times if there's grieving family or lots of onlookers who are very upset, I'll be called out to help with those scenes, and I'll also help with the police officers. I do ride-alongs with police officers while they're on patrol, and I go to their roll calls, their meetings at the beginning of their shift, and I try to participate in the life of the police department so I can help those first responders while they help people in our community.
That sounds like a really exciting area of pastoral work.
It can be, yes. It can be very exciting, be very interesting. Yeah.
What sort of drew you into that? How did you get into the idea of going from pastor to police chaplain?
It's funny. I never had any interest in law enforcement. I was not one of those kids who grew up playing cops and robbers, and I didn't fantasize of being a police officer someday. That was never an interest. But as I've been working in church for the last 25 years, God kept putting police officers in my church. And so I would be ministering to their family and to them, and also to military people. We're near a military installation, so we have a lot of military officers and their families. And so I kept encountering them and encountering the unique problems that they would have with the types of stress that they're exposed to, and the kind of difficulty and how isolating it can be. And so over several years, I kind of learned by trial and error how to help those families. And I just felt compelled I really needed to do more. And so I got involved with the local police department.
So what is your split of work like when it comes to supporting police officers and what they've been through, and then supporting maybe a grieving victim's family or something like that?
That changes from one chaplain to the next. Some chaplains are specialists with helping the victims of violent crime. They are trained counselors. They may be, clinical psychiatrists or psychologists. They have experience with, grief counseling and crisis counseling. And so sometimes they wear, that first hat of helping crime victims. They do that, and they do it really well, and they focus on that. I do some of that, but really my focus is more with the first responders. I want to have that other hat on where it's a long-term relationship instead of the short-term relationship. I want to have that long-term relationship with the officers and to help them and their families deal with the unique stresses of law enforcement. So I focus more on that end. I'm more interested in developing a rapport and trying to develop a trusting relationship with those officers before they're in crisis, before it gets to be too much for them or begins to affect their family in a negative way. I am efforting to build that relationship in advance, and I'm willing to take years to do it if that's what's needed.
What sort of things are you having to deal with? What sort of situations are you dealing with that first responders, police officers go through?
Well, that's really interesting. Typically, police officers are pretty well-adjusted people who they understand what kind of job they got into, and they manage the stress and cope with it pretty well most of the time. But sometimes they're thrown curveballs. The unexpected things happen to them that they don't expect, and so they probably had in their imaginations that they would be this person who would charge in and rescue the innocent. They would help out in a situation where maybe there's an abusive person hurting a woman or a child, and that they were going to help take that abuser out of the situation, or they were going to rescue somebody from certain death or that kind of thing. And that does happen in law enforcement. But sometimes an officer goes into that line of work expecting to see results, really positive results like that, where they made a difference and they can measure it, they can see it, they know that they helped. And sometimes it doesn't work out like that. And so they go into a situation, they remove, let's say that in that scenario I just described, an abuser that's hurting women and children, and they arrest that person and take them off to jail. But then a month later, they get called back out to the same address, and that woman has let that abuser back into her home, and he continued to hurt her and hurt her children. And all of that work was really kind of for nothing, or at least it feels like that work was not effective, that it was futile. And that creates a kind of loss in the officer because he sees that no matter how hard he tries, there's still going to be suffering in this world. And he thought he got into law enforcement to prevent suffering and to be the solution to suffering. And instead, his whole identity of himself or herself, it could be rattled, could even be lost, because it's like, well, why do I keep doing this? If these people are going to keep putting themselves back in bad situations with substance abuse and violence and all kinds of trouble, if I can't fix it, then what am I here for? And sometimes that begins to really erode at an officer's heart and his concept of himself and why he became a police officer to begin with, and they really grieve that. It's like suffering the loss. It's a loss of identity. And so he really is hurt by that and wounded by that. And typically police officers have a very tough exterior, and they don't admit that anything's bothering them. But in the inside, they may be really having a crisis of who they are and what they're doing, and really be suffering emotionally because of the loss of that identity and that sense of purpose that they thought they were getting into law enforcement for in the first place. So that's a tough thing for them to even understand about themselves. It's hard to tell from the outside where an officer is at, because if you ask them, are you okay? They all say they're fine. I'll go around and check on police officers at the scene of a homicide, and inevitably they'll all get real tough, and they'll be like, oh, Chaplain, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. This isn't my first dead body. And they probably are mostly fine. But eventually it starts to erode at who they are and what they are, and that will begin to affect them. And it can lead to substance abuse. It can lead to suicidal ideation. It can lead to just dysfunction in their life emotionally, where it erodes their relationships and it isolates them from their friends and family. And it can have all kinds of negative effects, just like anybody going through a grief process. It can have detrimental effects on the relationships of the people around you. And so these cops sometimes suffer in exactly the same kind of ways, but they're hiding it behind that tough exterior, and they don't trust people to just come in and help them. And so that's where, as a chaplain, I can speak their language. I'm with them in the patrol car and at the police station, and I understand, even though I'm not a cop, I understand their world well enough to speak to them and to maybe, with at least some of them, earn their trust. And that's my goal with that.
Usually I can kind of work out a way that you might be able to help people. But with this one, I'm thinking, how do you help someone? Because I can see that it would be a bit like, it doesn't feel very rewarding what I'm doing. It's not what I came in to do. Having this tough exterior, and I need to look like that because that's part of my job. People look to me for protection. And
yes.
And yet inside I'm struggling with all these issues. How do you help with that? Is that just relationship? Like you said, it's a long-term thing of building these relationships? Yeah,
chaplains call that the ministry of presence. And so you are present in their life and you share some of the bad experiences. Military chaplains are really good at this because a military chaplain, in theory, will parachute in with the soldiers into a combat zone. And even though the chaplain's not there to do combat, he shares the hardships of combat with those soldiers. He's on the ship with the sailors. And so he sees what they see. He eats the same food. He sleeps on the same schedule. He understands their world, even though he's not exactly the same as them. Mm-hmm. And so that is a huge advantage for a helper, where a lot of helpers, a lot of counselors and psychologists and such, they are very well educated, but they have no relationship to the world that police officer lives in. And they don't know the jargon. They don't know the ups and downs and the ins and outs, and it's very hard for them to learn. And usually a chaplain can help bridge that gap and kind of be that first line of pastoral help, religiously speaking, but also in mental health, kind of be that first counselor that they engage. Maybe not long term, but they can, guide a police officer toward more extensive counseling, more clinical help.
I can imagine there must be quite a few different barriers of going into work in that area for the first time. Having a faith or coming in as the chaplain, inverted commas,
yeah.
I'm guessing that's quite a big barrier at first, maybe to get over, because they might be a bit like, we don't need you.
Yes.
How do you get on with that?
Yeah, in the United States, we are definitely less religious than we were maybe 20 years ago. So there's more people who are unaffiliated, non-religious. That's more common than it was 20 years ago. Also, you're dealing with a demographic, usually young men in their 20s and 30s, who are notoriously non-religious. Some of these same people will be religious people 20 years from now, when they're in midlife. But at this stage, right out of college, they don't go to church. They don't want to admit anything about needing something spiritually. And so a chaplain comes in and does have that association with religion that may be very off-putting to them. And so a lot of times it is difficult to be a chaplain, and you walk into the police station and the police officers are swearing a blue streak, and they, they're telling some filthy story or telling a filthy joke. And then they turn around and realize the chaplain's already come in the room, and they're so embarrassed and they don't know how to act. And that can be a barrier. But I try to tell police officers, hey, I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to preach my religion at you. I am a religious person, but I'm here to help you. And you don't have to be religious yourself, or you could even be a different religion than what I practice. And I am still going to love you. I'm still going to help you. I'm still going to do everything I can to understand where you're at and provide assistance to you. And if a chaplain can stick with it and act with integrity and speak honestly and not be there for any ulterior motive, then usually I think a chaplain, in the matter of a few years, can start to experience some acceptance. But a lot of people don't have the patience for that. They want to walk in and get immediate results, and they want to get immediate respect, and that's not going to happen in a police department. I'm sorry. If you're an outsider, you're an outsider, and they don't want anything to do with you, and it's going to take a long time to get behind the badge. Some people have thrown out numbers of like 18 months or 2 years. I see that. I mean, I'm at my department now for 5 years, and I definitely am in a better place now than I was 5 years ago. But that clock starts at a different time with each officer. And so there's new officers who have transferred in or they're new out of the academy, and they've only known me for a few months. And so I really can't expect them to feel safe opening up to me or showing any kind of transparency or vulnerability until they've known me for probably a couple years. And that's difficult because they might have a crisis before then, but it's not reasonable to expect them to just open up and be vulnerable to an outsider before they've, before I've earned their trust.
Are there certain sort of crimes or situations they have to face that are more likely to have, I don't know, things come up that you need to help them deal with? Or is it more dependent on the individual and what affects them?
It is individualistic, and certainly, just like all of us, we all have our own vulnerabilities, our own set of things that we are sensitive to based on our own background. There are certainly some officers, if they grew up in an abusive home, when they go to a domestic violence call and they see the same kind of abuse, that's really going to affect them. And another officer wouldn't be affected by that at all. It's common that the call out to forgive me, but a dead baby. That is a particularly sensitive because everyone has compassion for children. And to see a hurt child or a dead child, that's very difficult, especially for some of these young men and women who are themselves starting families. And so they have a child the same age at home, and then they go out and they see this child that's been a victim of abuse, or maybe it's just a child that died of natural causes, but that is extremely difficult to see a young child who should be full of life, and they see that child is not full of life, and that's very hurtful. I've asked the sergeants and the captains in our department, if there is a call out for a deceased child, call me. I don't care if I'm on call or not. Call my personal cell phone and have me come out, not necessarily for the citizens that are experiencing that, because I can help there too, but primarily for the officers. Those officers are going to have that tough exterior, but I don't want them to turn to all of the bad coping mechanisms like drugs and alcohol or dangerous behavior. I don't want them to get on a motorcycle and drive 120 mile an hour and wreck that motorcycle and kill themselves accidentally because they're trying to work out the stress of what they've gone through. I want to try to be at least one of the options, and hopefully a very healthy option to help them out in a situation like that. But yeah, suicides and dead children and those kinds of things, those officers get called out. Every time it happens in our city, they get called out. And same with our firefighters and medical people. They see that and they're exposed to it, and it costs them something emotionally to see that again and again and again.
Do they come to you after that, or do you go to them? And can you make someone come and see you and chat to you if you think they've got issues, or do you have to wait for them to come?
You have to wait for them to come to you. I do make an effort to reach out to people. Like if we have an officer-involved shooting, which is when an officer has to draw a weapon and use force against somebody. It doesn't mean that they killed the person necessarily, but if they have to use deadly force against, it could be a perpetrator of a crime, but regardless of the scenario, if they have to use that force, I try to reach out to that officer, but I can't make them respond. I can intercept them. I can, I know what shifts they work, and I can make sure that I show up the same time they show up for work, and they have the opportunity to talk to me, but I can't make them. And so all I can do is try to be a good and reliable resource for them. And the ones who know me well will typically come to me, or they will recommend that their coworkers go to me to at least talk a little bit. Let's talk this out and see if we need to go on and do counseling with the department psychiatrist or with their family doctor or whatever. I mean, at least the talking to the chaplain could be the gateway to get more help later. But yeah, you can't make them. I try to be proactive, and I try to build those relationships. And if I know someone's in trouble, I try to make myself available, but you just can't make them do it.
They're going to know now when they see you turning up on their shift every week. They're like, hey, he's after me. I know he's after me. He's coming for me.
Yeah.
How does it affect things like, because I know the police, especially in America, they've got a bit of a bad reputation because of a few who do things that, aren't right.
Sure.
And that's got to be hard when it impacts a whole, well, we had every industry in the UK, the media, the politicians, everything has been attacked, always coming under fire for something. Does that affect morale on a more local level, or is it just more like, well, that happens?
Yeah, well, it's part of that demoralizing thing I was describing earlier, where part of the experience of law enforcement does not measure up to what they hoped it would be. And part of what they imagined was that people would appreciate them. Yeah. And most people do. But like a lot of us, one critic will be louder in our ears than 100 people who are happy with us. Yeah. And so that one critic can really steal your joy and really rob you of your self-confidence. And there are officers every year who quit, and they go and do another line of work simply because of the types of news stories that are out there. And right now in the United States, every department in America is hiring because they're all undermanned, and we're seeing some of the lowest numbers we've ever seen for new recruits coming in. And that's very discouraging. It's very disappointing. It makes it much more difficult for those officers who are still out there doing the work every day, because there's fewer officers to relieve them, which means that they're forced into doing overtime work, and they're working tired and exhausted, which means they might make more mistakes. Yeah. And here they are, really good people trying to do a good thing, and they're being vilified and criticized because of one in 100,000 that acts badly. But that's true. It is true in every line of work. It's one bad, doctor that gives all doctors a bad name. One bad minister, somebody who works in the church. I mean, really, there aren't that many priests and pastors who have abused children. The numbers are not really that high, but the ones who have, it was so scandalous and so damaging that really you introduce yourself as somebody who works at a church, there's going to be a percentage of people who are suspicious of you because of those few bad people. So police feel the same way. They're like, man, you see somebody go out and do something criminal, which police officers are the first in line to criticize that behavior. They will, at the drop of a hat, arrest a fellow officer for doing something illegal. They want that person out of the department. They want that person taken away from the work of law enforcement. They don't want a criminal giving them a bad name. But it does still happen, and that kind of thing is very damaging to morale.
So if you're taking all this in yourself, and I know you've done an episode recently on compassion fatigue, which I would imagine I can see would be something, what is your outlet? How do you then not become jaded by, because obviously they're getting a bit jaded, I'd imagine, by humanity. They see the worst stuff out there. You're helping them take that on. What do you do with it?
Yeah. In practical terms, I have adopted, since doing that interview, I talked to a chaplain in another state, and he requires all of his chaplains to call somebody immediately after a call. Even if you're not upset by it, you still go and you talk it out and move that traumatic experience from your short-term memory to your long-term memory, and you talk it out. And even if it's just a short debriefing, that's okay. But sometimes it turns into kind of impromptu counseling, talking to another chaplain. So I've adopted that and have practiced it just this week. I had 5 deaths that I was called to in about 48 hours. And that's unusually high for us. So I don't typically get that many calls. But we had 2 suicides, 2 natural deaths, and an overdose. And that wasn't necessarily any one of them that distressing to me, but I'm going to practice what I preach. And so I called another chaplain and I said, hey, here's what's been going on. Let me tell you about it. He asked me some questions, asked me how I was eating and sleeping and taking care of myself. And that was very good and very helpful. Now, in addition to that, I'm a Christian and my faith helps answer some of those questions. And so that's a great resource. I have a very stable family. I was raised by 2 loving parents who are still alive. And I have a lot of great resources. I've got 5 children and I love them. And so I've got a lot of healthy people around me. And that also is part of my, network of support. And so I try to implement it as many different ways as possible. I'm someone who is vulnerable to compassion fatigue. And so I'm always trying to eat a little better and get a little more exercise and do better than I've done before.
Just talk us through, if you get called out, what do you actually do when you get there? Are you hovering on the sidelines or do you get involved in a very practical way? What do you do?
Well, it's important for a chaplain to remember that we are not police officers. And that's tough because some chaplains used to be police officers.
Oh, gosh, yeah, that must be hard.
And so it's very difficult not to want to jump in and help. And even when I'm doing a ride-along where I'm on patrol for 8 hours with a police officer, I explain to them, okay, now listen, I'm not here to solve crimes and catch bad guys. I'm certainly not going to hinder you, and I'm not going to open the door and let the bad guy escape. But it's not my job to actively enforce the law. I am a citizen and I have certain responsibilities as a citizen, but I'm not a police officer. And so when I go, I have to be mindful of that because even though I'm not a police officer, I do represent the police officer. And if I respond to a homicide, there might be television crews there and other media who are reporting on the homicide. And I need to be careful what I say and what I don't say. Probably very important that I don't say too much because I do represent the department to some degree. So I have to be very cautious of that. I get called out and I usually put that first hat on and I help with the victims, and the family of the victims. How can I assist them in a short-term kind of way? Can I call a pastor or priest or rabbi? Can I contact a counselor or some other person's going to help them long-term? And I help move them to their support network if they have one. And so that's short-term care. I probably, after a few hours, will never see them again. But then I have that other hat where it's long-term care, and I go around and I check with all the officers, and I ask them how they're doing. And they each lie to me and tell me that they're fine. And
don't we all, though?
Yes, yeah. And so, I am trying to be present, and sometimes it'll be standing in the rain at the crime scene tape with an officer, and we'll stand there for an hour, and then finally he starts talking. And it may not be pertinent to the exact event that's going on right now, but maybe this event right now is triggering something that happened a year ago, and he'd just like to talk about it. And he can talk to me confidentially, and I don't report that to his superiors. I don't tell my wife about it. I don't tell anybody. It'll go to the grave with me. And so he can talk, and it's fairly safe, and sometimes that can develop. It doesn't always, but I try to make myself available to it.
And I've got maybe a strange question. What do you wear? Are you in police gear, or are you in church robes, or is it like a combination of the two? What are you wearing for this job?
I am typically wearing civilian clothes.
Right.
And so I typically have on very nondescript civilian wear, and then I have a lanyard around my neck that has my department identification. And so I have a picture ID that I wear around my neck, and I can show people if they're maybe not familiar with me or if they're from outside our agency, so I can identify myself. Now, I do have some chaplain clothing that has a logo on it or has the word chaplain printed across the chest or across my back. Sometimes that's helpful, especially at night, to have a jacket on like that. I also have a reflective vest, and so bright yellow, and it says chaplain on it. And so there's times like that where I'm wearing kind of police gear I mean, but it's not strictly speaking a uniform. And there are chaplains who do wear uniforms, and there are chaplains who are sworn officers and are actually a police officer, but their role in the department is chaplain. I'm a civilian volunteer chaplain, and so I kind of straddle that line because I'll pull up in a police vehicle. I have a department vehicle that when I'm on call, I drive a police car, but it has lights, but it doesn't have sirens.
Oh, that was my next question. Do you get to put the siren on?
Yeah. So
okay. Well, you get lights. That's the next best thing.
If a chaplain turned the siren on, they would take it away from us, and so it's very important that we know our place. Yeah.
Right. Is there anything that you ever hear come across the radio that you don't like? Like, is there a particular call that you think, oh, like your heart sinks a bit when you're going to it?
Yes. Well, this morning I came into the office, and before I turned the car off, a police officer was dispatched to check on what we call Signal 4. And that is a code that's used in our department for someone who is suicidal. And so I hear that, and I thought, boy, I'm going to go in and I'm gonna do this podcast interview, but I wonder if I'm going to get called out, because if that person has taken their life, I might get called to that. Now, I might not. I mean, sometimes somebody will be transported to the hospital, and the hospital will take care of the family. The hospital has its own chaplains, but it's very possible that I would get called out, and so yeah, I worry about that kind of thing. We had an officer-involved shooting a few years ago where I happened to be in the car listening to the police radio, and it came out over the air that somebody had a gun and they were shooting at police officers, and we had several officers involved in that. And I was just down the street, and I was able to respond and be on scene just moments after it happened because I was listening to the radio. But typically, I just wait for them to call me, and I act proactively just on my own to go out to the department, not responding to a call, but just responding to the officer's schedules. They come into work and they see the chaplain there and they say hi, and I'm just there for a few minutes. And then I go back to my day job. I go back to working at the church. That
must feel safer physically, I suppose, when you walk into that space for your job. It's a bit less risky.
Well, actually, there's a little bit of concern. We've had a rise in a particular type of crime against police officers in the United States, where there's been a little bit of an uptick of officers being ambushed, where they're in their car and they're not necessarily at the scene of a crime. They may be eating lunch or doing a report or watching traffic, and a person will sneak up on the car and assassinate the officer sitting in his car. And so that's happened a little bit more in recent years. In fact, we had an officer that died that way in our department. And so there's part of me that I'm in a police car that's marked. It says Chaplain down the side of it, but it also says, Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit of me that's concerned that being in that police car, having that police car parked outside the church, could actually make me a target. And I don't think that the likelihood is high. I think that's, 1,000,000 to 1 against anything ever happening to me in that scenario. But I'm a little bit concerned about that. That's a consideration, because I'm just there to help. But somebody who has it in their mind that the police are the enemy and that all police are out to hurt them, they might try to go hurt police proactively, and I could potentially get caught up in that. But I don't think that's a likely scenario.
No, it's the negative effect, I guess, of tarring people with the same brush, isn't it? Like you said, you get one bad person in an industry.
Yeah.
We've had a few local politicians here that have been shot or attacked just in their local constituency doing a meeting because someone's taken against the whole party.
Yeah.
You mentioned there about like the hospital having chaplains as well. And so there are obviously military chaplains, other areas that have it. What do you think the role of a chaplain adds to a workplace?
Well, I would hope that it would, at its most simple level, it would add another layer of help, that everybody deals with loss and grief and stress and family relationship dysfunction, and there's all kinds of those pressures, and that if there was a helper who was in your workplace and understood the kind of work you do and the kind of schedule you have and the kind of stress that you have, and that they were conscientiously looking to see how you were doing, that would get you into help quicker. It's just too common that people don't seek out help until they have to. They wait until their whole life is falling apart before they go to counseling or before they even just talk to somebody. And so I would hope that a chaplain in a place of work or a hospital or anywhere really, that would provide the opportunity. The problem is that a lot of times chaplains slip into a pattern of only helping after the crisis. A lot of hospital chaplains see that. They would like to help the nurses and the doctors, but instead they're only called to help the person who's already found out they have stage 4 cancer, or the family who has already lost a loved one. And that's still a place to help, and chaplains want to help that way. But really, it would be better if chaplains were used proactively and would help people before it's reached, a critical melting point, and we're able to move those people into a place where they could seek help and identify problems and fix the problems before they become unmanageable.
Does the title chaplain ever sort of prevent people doing that? Do they think, oh, well, I have to have the same faith as that person or else there's no point me going to them?
There's a lot of misunderstanding. Because chaplain... There's people listening to your podcast right now that don't know what a chaplain is. They just have, that's not a word in the vocabulary. And the only knowledge they have is that it might have something to do with religion. And if they're not religious, that's probably off-putting to them. And so yes, there is that barrier, but really, a chaplain is still a good word to use for those helpers. And there are chaplains who are not just Christian. I mean, obviously Christian chaplains have the longest history, but there are chaplains who are Jewish and Muslim and atheist chaplains. But they're there to help people. And the word chaplain comes from the patron saint of France, Saint Martin of Tours. He was, I believe, a Roman soldier who took off his cape, which is where the word chaplain comes from the word cape. And he took off his cape to put it around the shoulders of a hurting person. There was a woman or a child or somebody that was in need. And so he stopped being a soldier and became a helper by putting his cape around somebody to comfort them. And that is where chaplains began. And so a chaplain, anybody who can help someone else, and they're in a position to do it. I mean, obviously, if you're drowning, you're not the right person to help someone else who's drowning, right? But 5 years from now, you might not be drowning anymore, right? And so you might have learned how to swim well and how to help that other person, and you could be a good helper. And so certainly, like I said, Christianity has produced a lot of chaplains for the military and for law enforcement and for kings and queens and everybody else. We've done that for a long time, but really anybody could come in and be an effective chaplain and help people before they get to that crisis point and after.
Right. So if people are listening and they're in jobs where they're facing loss every day, be it police work or medical work or anything, are there like basic practical things that you would sort of say are really key for helping people do that in a healthy way?
Well, talking about it, yes. Yeah. There's, especially with men, there is a reluctance to be vulnerable. And so if you admit that something's bothering you, most men, just their knee-jerk reaction is, well, I don't want to admit that. You need to find a place where you can admit that. You need to find a place where maybe just with your colleagues, you're saying, boy, that really bugged me. Man, I have been thinking about that one event at work that was really traumatic, but it was like 3 months ago. And I think about it all the time. I've even dreamed about it. And being able to talk that out is a fantastic first step. Not everybody needs to go into counseling. Okay, not everybody needs to be on medication. But boy, if we could just start developing a healthy habit of talking about it and expressing ourselves and getting that out there, in many cases, that will be 90% of the battle. It's just talking about it and identifying it, realizing I'm not alone, realizing that other people struggle with this too. I'm not broken or uniquely unqualified to do my job just because it bothers me. getting that out there and discussing that is hugely helpful to people. And so that's just the most obvious first step. And like I said, I hope that chaplains help facilitate that.
Okay, so I've got one more question for you. We're speaking about like sort of police chaplains and the sort of work they do as a useful tool for helping people, and in this case, the police specifically, for preparing for or going through loss. So if I was to go into my shed and pick out a tool that represented police chaplains, what kind of tool would it be?
I want to suggest my favorite tool. My favorite tool is a tree pruner. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a cutting tool. Sometimes it's like a chainsaw or mechanical tool. Sometimes it's just a saw or maybe a couple different cutting tools at the end of a very long pole, usually a long telescoping pole. And my dad taught me to take care of tall, mature trees on our property by taking the pole saw or the tree pruner, whatever you want to call it, and going out there and helping these trees, because trees aren't just naturally healthy. They get broken branches, they get diseased branches, and a lot of times it's hidden up in the tree and you can't see it very well. But it's dangerous to the tree. It's dangerous to anybody under the tree. If the tree is going to be healthy, it needs to be pruned. And so you get out that long pole and you reach up there, and especially if it's not motorized, you've got to work and saw at the end of this 10 or 15 foot pole, and cut that branch out that's dead or damaged or diseased. And you have to watch yourself, because once it falls, you got to jump out of the way before it lands on you. But it's important work to keep the tree healthy. And so a lot of people have beautiful, tall, mature trees on their property, but they don't do anything to take care of it. They ignore the problem. And so I feel like, just like someone who is pruning a tree, a chaplain goes and identifies problems that we don't see or that we don't pay attention to. They're a little bit out of sight. Hopefully they're still small problems, and we can go in and help that problem, cut out that dead limb before it becomes a problem, before a gust of wind blows it out of the tree and it lands on somebody or something. That's just such an important part of taking care of trees. And so naturally I feel like chaplains, that's what we are too.
I love that new tool so much, and what a great analogy for supporting police officers in their work, enabling them to be strong and healthy with the important roles that they're taking on. If you want to find out more about Jared, check out his podcast, Hey Chaplain, and I'll put a link in the show notes. And thank you to all of those who are putting their life on the line to protect us. You are still greatly appreciated for the work you do and the situations you face, and I'm so pleased there are people like Jared out there willing to try and support people in these roles, giving up their time, mostly for free, just to help others. Thank you for listening to the Silent Why podcast. If you've got a subject you'd like me to chat to an expert on, please get in touch via our social media or the website, or on the email thesilentwhy@gmail.com. And let's chat.